As we go into the third part of our Identity Theft series, we want to ask the question today, what shapes your identity? And that's something that we've been kind of hinting towards even as of last week when we were talking about the story of Jacob and Esau. Right? And so we're gonna dive back into that story. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about what actually shapes your identity. Okay, so think about who you are as a person. Think about the things that you like, the things that you value, right? The things that you're into. And there's actually a multitude of things that kind of feed into your identity, that shapes you as a person. Right? There's a number of different things. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the things that the Bible also recognizes in terms of the things that shape your identity. Okay? So I would say that number one, when you think about who shapes your identity or what shapes your identity, most of you guys would probably say your family. Right? So your family is the one that gets to define your identity the most. So it's your parents, it's your brothers and your sisters, right? It's the people that live in your household, the people that you're constantly with, the people that have seen you naked, okay? And the people that have, that you're embarrassed to share your secrets with simultaneously at the same time. The people that you're most free with tends to be your family, right? They see who you really are, right? And so those are the people that get to shape your identity the most. And it's interesting because the Bible actually says that that is actually in fact the case. That's why in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 7, this is what God says. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's sons, by keeping all his statutes and commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. Okay? And so God is telling the Israelites as they are about to prepare to move into the promised land, that they need to be mindful of what they're teaching their children, right? For their sons and their sons' sons, that they understand who God is, how God pulled them up out of Egypt, that's really important. Because the way in which values, the way in which your faith, the way in which the things that are most important in life, those are going to be passed down from parents to children, from parents to children, from parents to children, one generation to the next. So the things that you actually value, the things that you think are most important, turns out that most of it's going to come from your family, right? The things that you value are going to come from your parents, right? And so that's why we have to be very mindful of where our influences are coming from. Verse 3, hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Again, in verse 3, he mentions, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you. So again, God's reminding the Israelites that they come from a generation of people who have passed down the faith and the promises of God, right? Constantly. Verse 4, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. Right? So Moses, right, through God, tells the people of Israel, you must constantly be talking about who God is, so that your children would get a grasp of that. Right? So again, teach them diligently in verse 7. Talk of it when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. Okay? And the idea is that the reason for this is because, again, children are going to be impressed upon by their parents. Primarily, that's where the identity is going to come from. Right? So I would even go so far as to say, for a lot of you guys, whatever your parents tell you about God, right, just because of the immense shadow of their influence in your life, is going to be probably even greater than what you hear from me. And I'm your pastor temporarily for a couple years. And that's how influential your parents are. That's how powerful your parents' understanding of the world is, because that gets passed down to you. Okay? And so it's very important that you recognize this, because you have to understand that whatever your parents are telling you about the Bible, telling you about God, you have to ask yourself, does it actually match up with what's actually here? Okay? And so that's really, really important for you guys to understand. And that's why we always want to make sure that you guys are learning the right things and knowing the right things, so that when you hear things that are incorrect, when you hear things that are wrong, you would have a sense to know whether or not those things are actually true. And that's it. That's why it's important for us as a church to make sure that your parents are actually talking to you guys about this stuff. That's why this year we said we were going to do the Gospel Project, and we were going to have a 3-year curriculum that was going to encompass every single department going through all of the same materials, so that all of the families at our church are walking through the same things. Again, so that we can be fulfilling this commandment. Because again, your identity comes from your family. The second thing that the Bible recognizes as defining your identity is actually your ethnicity. Okay, so most of us here are Korean, right? And that means that even though you may not think of yourself as very Korean, or maybe you think of yourself as super Korean, regardless, the fact that you're a Korean actually shapes your identity, right? You're going to grow up differently than somebody who is of a different ethnicity, okay? So a Hispanic person, a Canadian, right, a French guy, a Chinese guy, a Korean guy, they're all going to grow up differently because of their ethnicity, okay? In fact, this is what the Bible says about that, right? Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 2 through 4. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you and he would destroy you quickly. So a lot of times people read these kinds of verses and they go, oh, God's a racist. He doesn't want the Israelites to intermingle with other people. It's not so much that God's a racist, it's that he knows the sinful heart, right? And he knows that there are dangerous people that are out there that will turn you in another different directions, right? And again, in this day, again, at this time, it was linked to the ethnicity, right? There were certain tribes of people that did certain things, that were known for those things. It was part of their culture. And so God wanted to make sure that the Israelites had their own culture and they didn't intermingle and mix with these other cultures that were dangerous to them. Okay? Now, that doesn't directly apply here. Okay? I'm not telling you that as a Korean person, you can't marry another Korean person. All right. Sorry. Another person of another ethnicity. Okay? Although that's your parents' greatest fear, right? For a lot of my parents' generation, their greatest fear was that their children would marry somebody who is not Korean, right? Would marry like a black person or a white person, whatever. It was like their greatest fear. Like me and my brother were told all the time, you guys had better marry a Korean person, right? If you marry somebody else, right, you're not going to be allowed in the house. And so as a threat, we'd always tell our parents, I hate you, I'm going to totally marry somebody else, and I'm going to bring them in, and they're going to be like, who are you, and blah, blah, all this stuff. And it'd be an interesting threat, okay? But it's funny because that's not what God is telling the Israelites. He's not doing this, again, out of a seed of racism, but again, it has to do with the fact that God recognizes that ethnicities and cultures are distinct, right? So again, what makes you Korean is different than what makes somebody else, you know, Hispanic or Canadian or whatever, right? And so what that means is that we have different things that shape us in terms of our identity. Right? So we grow up with this idea that we have an Eastern mindset, okay? And that's different from the American culture, which is a Western mindset, okay? So an Eastern mindset, for an example, right, it's one of the reasons why we're called model minority, right? So Asians are called the model minority because the Eastern mindset is we're very, very proper and appropriate in terms of the way that we approach our elders, right? So think of the Korean language, right? There are informal words and then there are formal words, right? There are ways of saying sentences that are to adults and then that are to your peers and then that are to children, okay? And why is that? It's because Eastern cultures are built on an honor-based system or a shame-based system. The idea is that you need to honor the elder, or you need to honor people by talking to them differently than the way that you talk to your peers or you talk to people that are your subordinates or younger than you, right? For those of you guys that watch Korean dramas, right, there's always like a boss person, right? There's always a boss character, and the boss character talks a certain way to his employees, right? And then when like the president of the company comes, he talks another way to the president of the company, right? That doesn't exist in American culture, right? The way that you talk to your friends is the way that you would talk to your teachers, is the way that you talk to the President of the United States, right? Because in the American English language, there is no top, middle, bottom. There's just words, right? Now, you can be polite and that has to do with attitude, but in terms of words itself, there's no polite word, impolite word, or whatever, right? We don't really have that. And so, from that perspective, you guys, because, again, we're Korean, and that's our ethnicity, we tend to have that sort of Eastern mindset within us, where we tend to honor our elders. We tend not to speak up. Okay? It's one of the reasons why Asian nations tend to be more isolationist, meaning they don't get involved in world stuff. They tend to be more alone and to themselves. This is why when you visit a high school where there's a lot of Asian people, the Asian people tend to hang out with other Asian people, right? It's because we're trying to be our own little hermit kingdom on campus, right? And it's funny because when I was in high school, there were Korean kids that hung out with Korean kids. And then there was like 1 or 2, 3 Korean people that hung out with other groups of people, right? I was a Korean person that hung out with mainly Korean people, right? My wife, Tracy, she was not. So when she was in high school, she was hung out with all the other kind of different people. So when you look at our wedding pictures, my groomsmen, they're all Korean, right? Her bridesmaids, not a single Korean of them, right? Yeah, it's kind of crazy. But anyway, so again, we are shaped by our ethnicity. We are, it does matter to us, and maybe one day we can talk about that a little bit more. But the idea is that, again, these are the things that are intrinsically inside of us now. Right? So family is outside of us. Ethnicity is who we are. It's how we're born. Right? And so we're wired a certain way. Okay? And then the third thing that the Bible also recognizes as defining our identity is actually our friends. Okay? And this is really important for you guys. I would say, in terms of family, ethnicity, and friends, you would probably put friends at the top in terms of who gets to shape your life. Right? It's the people that you hang out with, or it's the people you aspire to hang out with. Meaning the people that you want to hang out with, those are the people that are going to inform, right? Those are the people that are going to inform your identity. Okay? Those of you guys with the headphones, can you guys take your headphones out? It's like super rude. You Case in point. Thank you. So it's your friends, right? So you will do what your friends do, right? You will go where your friends go. You will listen to what your friends listen to. You will go and hang out in the places that your friends hang out in. They're the ones that shape you, okay? And the reason why it's important for you guys to recognize that is because the Bible has a lot to say about that. So for example, Proverbs 13:20 says, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools suffers harm." Right? So this is why groups of friends tend to get into the same kind of trouble. Right? Because whatever a group of friends are doing, they're all kind of doing the same things. So for all of you guys really should have this verse like somewhere in your room to help and remind you that you need to make good decisions when it comes to your friends. Okay? I suggested to the earlier service that you guys, for those of you guys who have smartphones, all of your contacts, okay, when you go into your contact and edit a contact, there's a notes section there. Okay? For some of your friends, you need to make sure you write this proverb into the notes section. So that every time you're tempted to text them or call them or they call you, that note will pop up. And so you will be careful what you say in front of them, what you do in front of them, or whatever. But this is very, very true, right? There are people who are in prison and they will tell you how true this is. That they were caught doing something dumb because they were hanging out with people who were doing something dumb. Deep down inside, you know this. It's just hard to do this on a very practical level because you're already friends with these people. But I'm telling you right now, this will guide you for your entire life. This is not just junior high students need to be careful of this, high school students, no. Even as adults, it's very, very important who you're hanging out with because they shape you as people. Okay, now, these three things, they're obviously things that shape you. They are things that are true. They are things that you can recognize. You don't need Bible verses in order to back up the idea that your identity is shaped by your ethnicity, your identity is shaped by your family, your identity is shaped by your friends. Okay? But the question that we often don't ask, the one that's actually important, is who does God say you are? Right? That's the fourth thing, but I think that's the most important thing. And the one that we actually don't consider very often. Who does God say you are? Okay? Because if God is the one that created you, right, then God has the most information about who you are. And so if that's actually true, then in order for us to find out what our identity actually is, where do we need to go to find it? We need to come to God. Okay? So turn with me to Genesis chapter 35. Oops, chapter 32. 32, 22 through 32. Genesis 32, 22, 32. Genesis 32, 22 to 32. So the context for this is that Jacob's much older now. Okay? So Jacob has a brother named Esau. They're twin brothers. Esau's name means hairy. Jacob's name means he cheats or deceiver, basically. And so Jacob deceives Esau, and then he basically runs away. And Esau decides that he's going to murder Jacob. And so years and years pass. Jacob gets word somehow that Esau wants to meet with him. Okay? And so Jacob's trembling in his boots because he knows that Esau wants to kill him. But he decides that he needs to meet with his brother, and so they decide to have this meeting. But before they have this meeting, the night before they have this meeting together, what Jacob does is he sends off an envoy of gifts and presents to Esau. He says, I need to butter him up so that he doesn't hurt me, so I'm going to send him all of these things. So he sends it all across first, and then he decides that he's going to spend the night in the field. Okay? So We're going to be kind of diving into this story the night before Jacob meets his brother, who he thinks might kill him. Okay, verse 22. The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. Okay? So he sends his family across the stream, but he decides that he's going to stay alone in the camp that he's in. Okay? So right now, Jacob wants to be all alone. He wants to be completely isolated from others. He just needs time to think. Okay? And then look at what happens in verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Okay? Now, if you could predict where this story was going to go, nobody on earth would have said that, and then a man came to wrestle him. Okay? Like, this is so out of left field, this is so out of like nowhere, that it's kind of crazy. And it's so crazy that many people who read this story, they just read it and go, okay, that's what happened, and they kind of move on. Okay? But this is so crazy, we need to stop, and we need to say, what is going on here? Because basically, imagine that you're in part of Jacob's family. You're one of his sons. Okay? Imagine that your dad is really stressed out about something. Your dad is going to meet your uncle. Okay? And they hate each other, and they've been in this huge fight, and now they're about to reconcile. And your dad says, okay, we're going to go camping, guys. And then you and your dad and your family, you guys go camping. And he says, okay, I just need some alone time. I'm going to set up the tent for you guys, and you guys can be over here. I'm going to go set up a campfire over there, okay? And then he goes, he can't get a campfire started. Because your dad sucks at that kind of stuff. I don't know. I'm just making it up, okay? And he can't get a campfire started. It's all of a sudden dark. And then a man comes out of nowhere and starts wrestling your dad. Okay, like, that's such a weird story. Like, you're like, where is that coming from? I don't know. But we have to ask the questions like, who is this guy? Okay? Who is coming to this man in the middle of nowhere and deciding that he's going to wrestle him? Okay? And Jacob is probably thinking the same things, but again, if you're in the middle of nowhere, you think you're all alone, and then someone attacks you, what do? You attack them back, right? You try to figure out, who is this guy? Why is he trying to do all this, right? And it says in verse 24, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. Okay? So from dusk till dawn, Jacob ends up wrestling this man. Okay? That's a long time. Most people estimate anywhere from 6 to 7 hours Jacob wrestled this guy. Which is just, I mean, that's bonkers. Okay? It's like, why is this happening? Why wrestling? Why this struggle? Okay? Verse 25. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. So Jacob's wrestling with this guy, and it's been like 6-7 hours. Maybe they're talking about taking a break. I don't know. It seems as though, that there's kind of like, there's not really that much talking going around. It's just more wrestling, okay? And I guess when someone wrestles you out of nowhere, you're not really focused on anything else. You're just focused on beating the guy stranger who decided to come and wrestle you. But then the stranger does something crazy. He touches Jacob's hip, and then Jacob's hip gets dislocated. All he does is he touches him and he gets dislocated. Which sends a message to Jacob, right? Jacob knows, okay, wait, this guy's coming to me, he touches my hip gets dislocated. This is not a normal human being. Because normal human beings cannot do that. There's nobody on earth who is so strong that can touch a hip and have it dislocated. I know Bruce Lee had a 1-inch punch that was amazing, okay? But this is not, this man took his fingers and went like that, and then went, and then his hip, okay? That's not what happened. He touched it, okay? That's a miracle, right? So Jacob knows something's up. Something is not right, okay? Verse 26, then he said, and this is the man, so the man touches Jacob's hip, breaks his hip, and then he says, let me go, for the day is broken. So Jacob is seriously wrestling this guy, and he refuses to give up. Okay? And then he breaks his hip, and then the guy says to Jacob, let me go, for the day is broken. And this is how Jacob responds. I will not let you go unless you bless me. So Jacob knows the moment his hip gets dislocated, Jacob's thinking, this is a divine person. This is not a normal human being. This is a person who is divine. And so his hip pops out of the socket, and Jacob recognizes, I have to have this guy bless me. Okay? Verse 27, and he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. What is your name? And he said, Jacob. And this is actually the first time that they're even introducing each other. Okay? So they've been wrestling for 7 hours, not knowing who each other is. Okay? And then he breaks his hip, and he says, let me go. And he says, I can't let you go unless you bless me. And then he says, what's your name? And he says, Jacob. Now, what did I tell you Jacob meant? What's the name mean? Deceiver, right? Or he cheats. So what is Jacob admitting to this man? He's admitting to this man his identity. who he is. And Jacob's entire life has been marked by this identity, right? He was born, his name was, he cheats, right? And then what does he do? He screws over Esau, he screws over his dad, he lies about it, he gets screwed over himself because people lied to him. Like, his entire life is about deception. And so Jacob is forced to admit not just his name, but his brokenness, the thing that has been chasing him around all his life, the thing that he thinks he is. And look at how this person blesses him. Verse 28. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Okay? And what's interesting is that the name Israel means you have striven with God, which means you have fought with God, or God fights for you. It can actually mean both things. And so the name Israel is really important because that's what Jacob's name is transformed into. And notice, who was Jacob actually wrestling with? Turns out it was God himself. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed, and that's now Israel. Right? That's his name now. Right? That God has fought for you and you have fought with God. Okay? So your name is no longer deceiver. Your identity is no longer he cheats, but rather God is fighting for you because you have fought for God. Verse 29. Then Jacob asked him, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed him. That's interesting. So that this person that wrestled with Jacob, this person that is God, never gives him his name. Okay? He ends up giving it to Moses later on. And Moses asks, who shall I say sent me to Pharaoh in Egypt? And God says, tell him, I am sent you. But Jacob is not allowed to know God's name. Verse 30. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his hip. Okay? So Jacob wrestles with God. His hip is dislocated. God does not bless him and relocate his hip. God blesses him, changes his name, but lets him walk away with it. So for the rest of the time that Jacob is alive, he's going to have this limp. So from chapter 32 and on, Jacob now has a permanent limp. Okay? And for those of you guys that were studying the Gospel Project on this, you learned that the point of that is because when you have a true encounter with God, you don't come away the same person. Right? When you come into true contact with God, the God of the universe, you come away a different person. You have to. Verse 32, therefore to this day the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh. And again, because Moses is the person that wrote Genesis, he's telling the people of Israel, this is why we don't do this, because we're honoring the remembrance of this name Israel that came from this story in which Jacob wrestled with God. Okay? So, what does this have to do with identity? Well, basically, what you guys need to understand is when Jacob came to this place, okay, where he wrestled with God, he was struggling with who he was because he thought that he might die tomorrow. Right? He thought that Esau, his brother, was going to murder him. There was a good chance that his brother was still angry at him for stealing the birthright and was going to murder him. And Jacob was terrified of that. And so he's in a place that's super desperate and broken. In fact, Hosea chapter 12, verse 3 and 4 says this about Jacob. It says, in the womb he took his brother by the heel, and in his manhood he strove with God. Right? He fought with God. Verse 4, he strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. So verse 4 tells us that when Jacob was wrestling with God, he wasn't just demanding a blessing. He was weeping over this. Jacob was super distressed, right? He was in despair because he thought his life might end tomorrow. And so he comes in this place and he is completely broken about himself. And so when this man touches his hip, Jacob recognizes that there's divinity here. And so he holds onto him, he clings onto him, weeping and crying and saying, I don't want this identity. I don't want to be Jacob anymore. I can't handle being me because I've ruined my life up until this point. And now I'm in a position where I might be killed by my own brother tomorrow. And so what does God do? He says, your name shall no longer be called Jacob. I give you a new identity. You are given a new name. Right? He does this with Abraham as well. Right? Abraham wasn't always Abraham. It was Abram. Abram's name means father is exalted. But then when Abraham becomes much older, as a way to let Abraham know that God's going to fulfill his promise, he says, you're no longer going to be called Abram, which is father is exalted, but you're going to be called Abraham, which means father of a multitude. So he's given a new name. In the New Testament, there's also a character who's also given a new name. Right? His initial name, when we see him in the book of Acts, his name is Saul. Right? And then Saul is actually a guy who was a super Jew. That's the best way to put it, right? He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was just crazy, like zealous for God, but completely in the wrong direction. And so he thought when Christianity started to come up that he had to go around and start killing them and start putting them in jail. He thought that his job was to cut Christianity at the root. But what happens is he's riding on a horse one day on his way to Damascus, and God shows up, right? Knocks him off of his horse. And Jesus says to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And from that moment, Saul's life is completely changed, right? And Saul goes out and becomes not a Christian killer, but a witness to the Gentiles as a Christian. He starts planting churches everywhere. And it's really amazing and really awesome, his story, right? And at some point in the book of Acts, his name changes from Saul to Paul. And it's interesting because it's actually the same name, but we're just talking two different languages. So Saul is the Jewish name. Paul is the Greek or the Roman version of that, right? It's kind of like John in English is Juan in, not Korean, in Spanish, right? So it's kind of the same thing, right? So why is he being called Paul instead of Saul? Why is he identifying as himself as a Gentile? Because that's who he was called to go and minister to. So the moment that he interacts with God and God meets him, his name also transforms. And this is what he says of himself. This is what Paul says of himself. 2 Corinthians 12:9. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ then I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Right? Paul says this not because he is puffed up in his own identity. He says this because God has broken his identity down, and all he knows that he has is Christ. And so the thing that I want you guys to understand is this is how our identity is supposed to be shaped. We are supposed to be shaped by Christ in this way, right? So the question is, what is it that defines you, right? Is it your grades? Is it your parents' acceptance? Is it whether or not you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend? Is it how well you play a certain game? Is it how well you do in certain sports? Is it what chair you are in an orchestra? Like, there's so many different things that can define us. But the idea is that, again, if any of that stuff gets taken away, then we will be crushed under the weight of that. And we will fall into depression, and we will no longer know what our life is about. We won't know how to define our own lives. And what does Paul tell us? Paul tells us, well, the only way that you can prevent that, right, is to come before Christ in your weakness. And when you come before Christ in your weakness, he is faithful to provide you with his strength and his identity. Paul says again, one last time in Philippians chapter 4, "Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." Now that verse 13 is really famous, right? A lot of people like to put that on shirts and stuff and say, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." And the truth is, if you take that verse out of context, it almost sounds like you can do anything as long as Jesus is with you. That's not true, okay? That's not true. You can't do everything as long as Jesus is with you. What this verse is talking about, and that's why I'm giving you verse 11 and 12, is the idea of being content. Okay? And for so many of you guys, the reason why we're going through this series is because you're not content with your life. You're not content with your life. You don't have enough. Right? If your identity is shaped by the cool friends that you have, right, the things that you wear, you always need more. You need more clothes. You need better friends. You need to hang out with the other cooler group. There's an even other cooler group, right? There's those older kids that you need to hang out with. If your definition is shaped by your grades, then it's always, I can do better. I can get better grades. If your identity, again, is shaped by your parents' acceptance, okay? Let's face it, most of us live in Korean households. Our dads aren't going to tell us very often, "I'm proud of you." Those words aren't going to come out all the time, right? Because our dads are Korean. That's not how they communicate that love. They'll buy you stuff, but they won't say, "I love you" or "I'm proud of you," right? And so there's this Western part of you that's like, that's all I want from my dad. And so you will do whatever you can to get that. Right? Or hear that from your mom, or whatever it is. And so again, you put all of these expectations on other people to form your identity, and when things don't go the way that you think they're going to go, it comes tumbling down, and it's very hard to build yourself back up. Some of you guys are in that place. You're not content with your life because you don't have enough. And what Paul is telling us in Philippians is, my identity is found in Christ, and so I can do all things through him who strengthens me. I can be content when I have a lot. I can be content when I have very little. So his consistency in his faith is found in his ability. ability to understand that his identity is in Christ. And I also want to say this because, again, the holidays are coming around, right? So you have Thanksgiving, and then now you have like decorations in the malls and places, and trees are going up, and every movie and music on the airwaves and television and all that is all going to be about happy family stuff and different things like that. The truth is, a lot of us come from broken homes. A lot of us come from homes where the holidays aren't necessarily a happy time, right? There's strife between families. There are certain family members that are allowed to come over. There are certain family members that aren't allowed to come over. Maybe they came over last year, they're not allowed to come around this year, or you can't go to certain family members' houses just because there's all this family drama. And so I just want to be very clear on this, okay? I don't believe that the holidays are going to be happy for everybody. I think there's a subsection of us that are going to have a really, really miserable next couple of weeks. In fact, you hate this time of season. You hate this idea of like, you know, all your friends talking about all the family stuff that they're doing when your family doesn't do much. Or you don't have that much family around, or whatever it is. And I'm telling you right now, again, Christ wants to encourage you today, to help you recognize that that's not what should be shaping your identity anyway, right? What should be shaping your identity is not how bad things are at home, but who Christ is and what Christ did for you on the cross. And we want to continue to have that be front and center because that's what's going to provide us with hope on the bottom. I'm going to ask you guys to close your eyes. And I just want you guys to spend a few moments in prayer. Because a message like this means different things to different people. Right? For some of you guys, you need to recognize that there is idolatry in your life. You have lifted up certain things to be God, and you are worshiping those things. And it's the worship of those things that's when they come crashing down or when they're not able to satisfy you, as they won't, because they can't. You're going to be devastated. And so you need to turn away from those things and turn to Christ. There's another group of us who we can't help. We feel like we can't help where we find our identity. The things that are going on at home, the things that are happening with our friends. There's such a strong force in our life, and we don't know how to navigate our life around it. We feel like stuck. We feel like we're just not able to get traction. And a lot of you guys, you just feel restless in your heart. You feel restless in your life. You don't feel like God's really doing much. You don't really feel like you're doing much. If I were to ask you what your prayer request is, a lot of you guys would just say, I'm struggling. I feel lazy. Or I don't feel like doing anything. I'm not motivated. Like, why is that? Perhaps it's because our identities are found in the things that we can't control. And so we're constantly, because we keep hanging on to these things and we keep saying, this is what defines me. It's my grades. It's whether or not my parents say I love you. It's whether or not this girl or this guy likes me. It's whether or not my friends accept me. It's whether or not this teacher likes me. It's whether or not... And there's all of these different things. And some of you might even be wondering, does God even like me? And so you're constantly trying to adjust your life to fit all of this stuff. And you're so tired at this point that you're just completely restless. You're unmotivated. You're saying, I don't want to do this anymore. And I'm telling you, that's not what God wants for you. So how do you deal with that? You package all of that up. You take all your brokenness and you lay it at the foot of Christ. You take all your brokenness. You take all of the things that are shattered and broken in your life. All that unmotivation, you just gather that all up and you come before the cross of Christ. You lay it before Him and you say, Jesus, my identity is broken and it's worthless. And I want to lay it before you and I want you to give me a new identity. And at the foot of the cross, when you come, you might come with this idea that you are a failure or that you are not successful. Maybe you're a loser, you're unlovable. Right? You're a sinner, you're no good, you're a deceiver, whatever it is that you might come to the foot of the cross with, your identity can be exchanged for that of Christ. What does God say of Jesus? God tells us that Jesus was His beloved Son. At the foot of the cross, you won't be called deceiver, you won't be called he that cheats, you won't be called sinner, you won't be called loser, you won't be called failure, you will be called the perfect beloved child of God. Forgiven, right? Loved. Worthy of sacrifice. These are the names that have been given to you. And it's there for the taking. We just have to come and be broken enough to want that from God. But if you're going to be prideful and you're going to hang on to your identity and you're going to think that your identity is more valuable than whatever God has to offer. There will be a day when it comes crashing down. There will be a day when it can't sustain you, because nothing in the world can sustain you the way that God can. And so I want you to know that, because when it does happen and when you're broken and you come before Christ, just know He's always there. He will take that and He'll give you a moment. But why wait? Why not have that peace and that comfort and the joy of knowing who you are in Christ? So Heavenly Father, I pray, Lord, that you would help us, again, to come before you humbly, to lay down our identities before you, that you would help us to be broken enough, that we would come, and just like Jacob, weeping and just in despair of his life, here, Lord, that you would take us to that place as well, that we would have our identities broken and shattered so that we can receive the true identity that comes from Christ. I pray, Lord God, that in our heart of hearts, that there would be a name change, that whatever it is that we are calling ourselves, Lord, that we would get rid of those identities and instead take upon the identity that comes from Christ. I pray, Lord, again, that you would help us to strive this week with you and for you, and you're striving for us. In Jesus' name we pray.